On the 29th of May, 1453, the army of Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople after a 53-day siege. By the evening, the city that had been the capital of the Roman and then the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, the city that had survived sieges by Avars and Slavs, by Arabs, by Crusaders, by Bulgars, by multiple Ottoman predecessors, to Mehmed himself, was in Ottoman hands. The Roman Emperor Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, died in the final fighting, reportedly in the melee at the breached walls. His body was never definitively identified. The last emperor of Rome died as a soldier in the street. The fall of Constantinople is, in the standard Western historical periodization, the event that marks the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period, a periodization choice that reflects both the genuine magnitude of the event and the Western European perspective through which this history has typically been told. For the Byzantine Greeks who survived the city's fall, it was a civilizational catastrophe of the most immediate kind. For the Ottoman Empire, it was the completion of a strategic objective that had defined their geopolitical position for nearly a century. For the broader history of Eurasia, it was the end of an institution, the Roman imperial tradition that had run continuously since Augustus, that had shaped the politics, law, culture, and religion of a vast swath of the world for 15 centuries. The city that Mehmed besieged in the spring of 1453 was a ghost of the Byzantine Empire at its height. The empire that had once controlled Anatolia, the Balkans, Egypt, Syria, and North Africa had been ground down by centuries of war, plague, economic decline, and the catastrophic damage inflicted during the Fourth Crusade of 1204, when Western Crusaders, nominally fellow Christians, had sacked Constantinople, established a Latin empire on its ruins, and left a Byzantine restoration that never recovered its former strength. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire consisted essentially of the city of Constantinople itself, a few islands, and the Despotate of the Morea in the Peloponnese. The city's population, which may have reached 500,000 at its peak in the 6th century, had fallen to perhaps 50,000. The empire's revenues were inadequate to maintain its walls, pay its soldiers, or sustain the administrative apparatus of a functional state. The Emperor Constantine had approximately 7,000 soldiers with which to defend walls extending over 22 kilometers. Mehmed brought an army estimated at approximately 80,000 to 100,000 men and a train of artillery that included the largest cannons that had ever been built. The most formidable of these, cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine emperor and been turned down for lack of funds, was capable of firing stone balls weighing approximately 500 kilograms. The walls of Constantinople, which had repelled every previous assault for 1,000 years, had been built in the 5th century without reference to artillery of any kind. The role of artillery in the fall of Constantinople represents one of the clearest cases in military history of a defensive technology being rendered obsolete by an offensive one. The Theodosian walls, the main defensive circuit built by the Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century, were an extraordinary engineering achievement for their time. A triple line of walls with a moat, incorporating towers at regular intervals, built to a depth and height that made them effectively impassable to any force that lacked the ability to breach them from range. For 1,000 years, they had functioned exactly as designed. Every assault that had relied on ladders, siege towers, rams, or direct infantry assault had failed. Urban's great cannon changed the equation. The stone balls it fired were heavy enough and fast enough to crack and eventually collapse sections of the outer wall. The Byzantines repaired the breaches at night with rubble and wood, working desperately to maintain the defensive line. But the Ottoman artillery fired by day, and the repairs were completed by night, and the cannon resumed the next morning. Over the course of the siege, the Theodosian walls were progressively degraded at the sections where the heaviest fire was concentrated. The final assault on the night of May 28th to 29th came at the weakest points, where the damage had been most severe and the defense was thinnest. The initial breach was made at a gate called the Kirka Porta, which had been left inadvertently unlocked in the confusion of the fighting, a small operational failure whose consequences were enormous. Ottoman troops poured through, and the subsequent collapse of the defense unfolded rapidly. The fall of Constantinople also involved an intelligence failure and a defensive miscalculation that has been analyzed by historians in the centuries since. The Byzantines had extended a chain across the Golden Horn, the harbor inlet north of the city, to prevent Ottoman ships from sailing into it and attacking the sea walls from that direction. The chain worked initially. Mehmed's response was to transport approximately 70 ships overland on greased wooden rollers, bypassing the chain and launching them into the Golden Horn behind the defensive line. The Byzantines woke on the morning of April 22nd to find an Ottoman fleet inside their harbor. This maneuver forced the defenders to thin their already inadequate garrison along the sea walls to defend against the new threat, reducing the concentration of defenders at the land walls, where the main Ottoman assault would eventually fall. The Genoese colony of Galata, located across the Golden Horn from Constantinople, maintained official neutrality during the siege. Genoese volunteers, most notably the Conte Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who commanded the defense of the land walls with great skill for most of the siege, fought on the Byzantine side as individuals. But the Genoese colony as an institution did not commit its resources or its walls to the defense. The fundamental isolation of Constantinople, abandoned by the Latin West, whose promised military relief never came in the quantities required, was as significant a factor in its fall as any Ottoman military superiority. The consequences of a city's fall spread across the following decades in multiple directions. The immediate flight of Byzantine scholars to Italy, carrying Greek manuscripts, the intellectual tradition of ancient philosophy and literature, and the educational expertise to teach Greek language and thought to Italian humanists, is widely credited with accelerating the Renaissance. Works of Plato, Aristotle, and other ancient authors that existed in complete form only in Byzantine libraries reached Western Europe through this refugee diaspora. The recovery of ancient Greek learning that had been preserved in Constantinople for centuries and was now flowing westward through the dispersal of its scholars and libraries contributed directly to the intellectual transformation of 15th and 16th century Europe. The fall also disrupted the overland trade routes between Europe and Asia, the Silk Road corridors that passed through territories now under Ottoman control and were subject to Ottoman taxation and commercial policy. This disruption intensified the commercial pressure to find alternative sea routes to Asian markets, contributing to the Portuguese and Spanish maritime exploration programs that within decades had reached West Africa, India, and the Americas. Mehmed's own use of the title drew explicitly on the imperial legacy he had acquired. He called himself Kaiser Rome, Caesar of Rome, and styled his court and administration with deliberate references to the imperial tradition. The Ottoman Empire was not merely a successor state that had conquered a predecessor. It was making a specific claim to the continuity of the Roman imperial tradition. The Roman Empire, in its eastern form, as the Byzantine state that had governed Constantinople since Constantine moved his capital there in 330 of the Common Era, had run continuously through wars and plague and religious crisis and economic decline and territorial contraction for over 1,000 years from the refounding of the capital to its fall in 1453. It was in the scope of human institutions, almost uniquely durable. The legal tradition it transmitted, the Christian religious institutions it sustained and defined, the Greek scholarly tradition it preserved, and the administrative models it developed influenced every subsequent political entity in the territories it had governed. The cannonball that cracked the Theodosian Wall in the spring of 1453 ended that continuity in a single siege. The walls that had held for 1,000 years had not been designed with artillery in mind. The empire that depended on them had run out of the resources that might have adapted to the new technology. And the Christian powers of Western Europe, who might have reinforced the defense, had their own reasons, political, commercial, and theological, for not arriving in sufficient numbers. Constantine XI died in the rubble. The city his predecessors had defended for 11 centuries became the capital of a new empire.